The honeysuckle blooms heavy tonight, clinging to the porch rails like secrets to an old woman's tongue. It's 78 degrees, warm for October in Missouri, and I'm sitting here in my grandmother's rocking chair, feeling the weight of 82 years settle into my bones like morning frost. My name is Iris Bell Kincaid, and there's something I need to tell you before I join my Harold in that little cemetery behind the Baptist church. People in Cotton Ridge still wave when they pass my blackberry patch, still buy my apple butter at the farmer's market, still call me Miss Iris with that respectful nod folks save for the elderly. What they don't know, what I've carried like a stone in my chest for 63 years, is that the thing I once thought was hunger, was desire, was the natural stirring of a young woman's heart, was actually something else entirely. It was a ritual designed to break the human spirit, as methodical and cold as the way you'd break a horse. I was 18 when I learned that evil doesn't always wear a devil's face. Sometimes it wears a three-piece suit and owns 320 acres of the finest farmland in 3 counties. Sometimes it has a medical degree and speaks in soft, reasonable tones about treatment and necessary interventions. And sometimes, God forgive me for how long it took me to understand this, sometimes it masquerades as salvation itself. The pocket watch still ticks in my jewelry box upstairs. Solid gold, with an inscription that reads, "To Caleb, with gratitude, the community of Cotton Ridge." I kept it not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Every night before I say my prayers, I wind it up and listen to that tick, tick, tick. The sound that once made my skin crawl now serves as a metronome for memory, counting out the seconds between then and now, between the girl I was and the woman I became. It started with my father's cough. That dry, rattling sound that echoed through our little 2-bedroom house like death knocking on the door. Tuberculosis, Doc Whitfield called it, though he whispered the word like it was a curse. In 1947, that diagnosis was a family's financial death sentence. The sanatorium in Jefferson City cost more per month than most men made in 6. We had $37 in the tin can behind the flour sack, a dying dairy cow, and about 2 weeks before the bank would come calling for the mortgage. That's when Caleb Thorne paid us a visit. I remember the sound his boots made on our front porch. Confident, measured, like a man who'd never doubted his place in the world. He was 59 years old then, though he carried himself like someone younger, with shoulders straight as fence posts and hands that had never known real work despite owning half the county. His face was what my grandmother would have called handsome enough, with gray eyes that seemed to measure everything they looked upon. "Mrs. Kincaid," he said to my mother, removing his hat with practiced courtesy, "I believe we might be able to help each other." Mama invited him in, of course. In Cotton Ridge, you didn't turn away a thorn from your door, not if you wanted to keep living there. I watched from the kitchen while I pretended to knead biscuit dough, my hands working the mixture while my ears strained to catch every word. "The situation with your husband," Caleb said, his voice carrying the kind of gentle authority that made you want to agree before you knew what you were agreeing to. "It's unfortunate. I know what medical care costs these days. I also know what land is worth, and yours is good land. Fertile. Worth preserving." He laid out the terms like he was dealing cards, each one placed with deliberate care. He would pay for Papa's treatment, settle the mortgage, and provide a monthly stipend for my mother and little sister Lydia. In return, I would become Mrs. Caleb Thorne. A fair trade, he called it. An investment in the community's future. I was 18 years old and I thought I understood what marriage meant. I thought I knew what happened between a husband and wife, what was expected, what would be required. The girls at school whispered about it sometimes, giggling behind their hands about wedding nights and honeymoons. What I didn't understand was that there are different kinds of expecting, different kinds of requirement. Some are born of love or at least affection. Others are born of something far colder. The wedding was small, held in the parlor of the Methodist church with only our immediate family and Pastor Whitmore presiding. I wore my mother's dress, taken in at the waist and let down at the hem, and carried a bouquet of wild roses that Lydia picked from the roadside. Caleb wore his best suit and smiled at all the right moments, even kissed me gently after we said our vows. If I hadn't been watching his eyes, I might have believed he was happy. But his eyes were wrong. They looked at me the way a man looks at livestock he's just purchased. Appraising, calculating, already planning how to get the best use from his investment. The Thorne farmhouse sat on a gentle rise about 2 miles outside town, a grand 2-story Victorian with gingerbread trim and wraparound porches that had housed 3 generations of Thornes. It should have felt like a palace after our little shotgun house, but from the moment I crossed that threshold as Mrs. Caleb Thorne, it felt more like a prison with nice wallpaper. "I run an orderly household, Iris," Caleb told me that first evening as he showed me to what would be our bedroom. "I believe in routine, in knowing what's expected and when. You'll find I'm a reasonable man if you're reasonable in return." The bedroom was larger than our entire front room back home, with heavy mahogany furniture and windows that faced west toward the setting sun. Everything was clean, orderly, and somehow cold despite the warm September evening. The bed dominated the space, a massive 4-poster draped in burgundy velvet that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. That's when he showed me the schedule. It was posted inside the wardrobe door, written in Caleb's precise handwriting on letterhead from his office at the cotton mill. Times, dates, frequencies. Clinical notations about what he called household obligations. I stared at it with growing confusion that slowly crystallized into something approaching horror. "I find that regularity prevents misunderstandings," he said, pulling his pocket watch from his vest. The gold caught the lamplight as he opened it, revealing not just the time but a small notation penciled inside the cover. "When expectations are clear, everyone knows their place." That night, at precisely 9:30, the watch chimed. Not rang, not buzzed, but chimed with a delicate musical sound that seemed to fill the entire room. Caleb looked up from his newspaper, closed it carefully, and folded it with the same precision he brought to everything else. "Time, Iris," he said. Those 2 words would haunt my dreams for the next 5 years. Not because of what followed, though God knows that was horror enough, but because of the way he said them. Like announcing the weather or calling someone to dinner. Matter of fact. Routine. Just another item to be checked off the day's list of necessary tasks. What I learned that night, and in the nights that followed, was that there are as many ways to take a person apart as there are to put them together. You can do it with violence, certainly, but Caleb's method was far more sophisticated. He broke people down like a chemist breaking down compounds, separating the essential elements until nothing remained but basic components that could be reorganized according to his specifications. The routine was everything. The same time, the same approach, the same absolute lack of acknowledgement that I was anything more than a function to be performed. He never looked at my face, never spoke except to give instructions, never showed the slightest awareness that what was happening involved another human being with thoughts and feelings and fears. Afterward, he would wind his watch, record something in a small leather journal he kept in the nightstand, and settle down to sleep as if nothing had happened at all. I would lie there in the dark, staring at the ceiling and trying to understand how something that was supposed to create life could feel so much like death. The days weren't much better. Caleb left for the mill at precisely 7 each morning and returned at exactly 5:45 each evening. During those long daylight hours, I was left alone in the house with nothing but chores and silence for company. No car, no way to get to town without asking permission. No telephone. He'd had it removed, claiming it was an unnecessary distraction. Letters were opened and read before I saw them, and any I wanted to send had to be approved first. I began to understand that the isolation wasn't accidental. It was as carefully designed as everything else in Caleb Thorne's world, meant to wear away at the edges of my identity until I forgot there had ever been an Iris Bell beyond these walls. Some days I almost succeeded in forgetting. It would have been easier if I had. But then I found the loose floorboard in the sewing room, and everything changed. It was a Tuesday afternoon in early November, about 6 weeks after the wedding. I was hemming kitchen curtains, another item on Caleb's extensive list of household improvements, when I noticed that one of the wide pine planks gave slightly under my foot. Probably just the house settling, I told myself, but something about the way it moved nagged at me. When I knelt down and pressed against it with my hands, I could feel it shift. It took me the better part of an hour to work it loose, using the blade of a butter knife to pry up one corner until I could get my fingers underneath. The space beneath was shallow, maybe 4 inches deep, but it contained a collection of items that made my blood run cold. Photographs first. Studio portraits of 2 women I didn't recognize, both young and pretty in that fresh scrubbed way that spoke of farm living and honest work. One had dark hair pinned back severely, with eyes that held just a hint of wariness. The other was blonde, softer looking, with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Both wore wedding dresses. Underneath the photos were documents. Marriage certificates bearing Caleb's name and the names of the women in the pictures. Eleanor Thorne, dated 1935, and Bonnie Lee Thorne, dated 1941. Death certificates for both women, each listing cause of death as suicide, dated within 2 years of their respective marriages. And strangest of all, train tickets to St. Louis Union Station, one-way tickets that had never been used. But it was the handwritten note clipped to Bonnie Lee's train ticket that made my hands shake as I read it. Ward C. Private Wing. Drive E. Pike attending. Patient demonstrates severe melancholia with violent tendencies. Indefinite commitment recommended. I sat back on my heels, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. 2 wives, both supposedly dead by their own hand, both with unused train tickets and what looked like commitment papers for a psychiatric facility. The dates didn't make sense, the circumstances didn't make sense. Nothing made sense except for the terrible certainty growing in my chest that I was looking at evidence of something far worse than an unhappy marriage. That night, when Caleb's watch chimed and he spoke those 2 familiar words, I understood for the first time what was really happening. This wasn't about desire or duty or even dominance. It was about breaking me down systematically, piece by piece, until I became unstable enough to require treatment. Until I became inconvenient enough to disappear, just like Eleanor and Bonnie Lee. But understanding a trap and escaping it are 2 very different things. And as I lay there in the dark, listening to Caleb's even breathing beside me, I began to realize that I had stumbled into something much larger and more dangerous than one man's twisted marriage arrangements. The notation about Dr. Pike, the official-looking documents, the careful timing of it all. This wasn't the work of a single predator. This was organized, systematic, and almost certainly ongoing. Which meant that somewhere out there, other young women were walking into the same trap I had found myself in. And somewhere else, Eleanor and Bonnie Lee might still be alive, locked away in Ward C of some psychiatric facility, declared legally dead while their hearts still beat. The thought that should have terrified me beyond measure instead filled me with something I hadn't felt since my father's diagnosis. Purpose. Because if I was right, if this was bigger than just Caleb Thorne's particular brand of cruelty, then surviving wasn't enough anymore. I was going to have to fight back. The grandfather clock in Caleb's study chimed midnight, its deep bronze voice carrying through the house like a funeral bell. I lay perfectly still, counting the seconds between his breaths, waiting for the rhythm that would tell me he was truly asleep. 120 seconds. That's how long it took, every single night, for Caleb Thorne to surrender to unconsciousness. I had learned to measure time in those small intervals of freedom. When I was certain he wouldn't wake, I slipped from the bed like smoke, my bare feet finding the spots on the floorboards that wouldn't creak. The house had taught me its secrets over these past weeks, which steps to avoid, which doors to ease shut, how to move through the darkness like a ghost in my own home. Skills I never thought I'd need. But then again, I'd never imagined I'd be married to a man who treated women like livestock. The sewing room had become my sanctuary, the one place where I could think clearly. I'd taken to spending my afternoons there, officially working on mending and alterations, but really trying to piece together the puzzle of Eleanor and Bonnie Lee. The loose floorboard had given up more secrets since that first discovery. A small leather journal with entries in 2 different handwritings, a tarnished silver locket containing a photo of a little girl, and most disturbing of all, a series of letters that had never been mailed. The letters were what convinced me I wasn't losing my mind. Both women had written to family members, pleading for help, describing symptoms that I recognized from my own experience. Exhaustion that went deeper than tired. Confusion that felt like fog settling over your thoughts. The growing certainty that something was terribly wrong, coupled with the inability to articulate exactly what that something might be. "I know how this sounds," Bonnie Lee had written to someone named Margaret, in handwriting that grew more erratic as the letter progressed, "but I think Caleb is putting something in my food. I sleep too much, and when I'm awake I can't think straight. Yesterday I couldn't remember my own middle name for nearly an hour. The doctor says it's nerves, but Margaret, what if it isn't? What if?" The letter ended mid-sentence, as if she'd been interrupted, or as if she'd suddenly doubted her own sanity enough to stop writing. Reading those letters was like looking into a mirror that showed the future instead of the present. I could see myself in their words, recognize the path I was being led down with the same methodical precision Caleb brought to everything else. The realization should have driven me to despair, but instead it crystallized my determination. These women had been isolated, cut off from anyone who might have helped them. But I had something they hadn't had. I had Ruthie Mae Talbot. Ruthie Mae was what my mother would have called a force of nature. A 46-year-old widow who ran the ladies' auxiliary at the Methodist Church with the efficiency of a railroad conductor and the compassion of a saint. She had a way of seeing straight through the polite lies people told in small towns, and more importantly, she had a way of making people feel safe enough to tell her the truth. It was Ruthie Mae who approached me after services the Sunday following my discovery of the floorboard cache. The congregation was filing out into the November sunshine, and Caleb was discussing cotton prices with some of the other landowners, when she appeared at my elbow like she'd materialized from thin air. "Honey," she said, her voice pitched low enough that no one else could hear, "you've lost near 10 pounds since your wedding day. That's not healthy for a young woman just starting married life." Her pale blue eyes studied my face with the intensity of a doctor examining symptoms. "Everything all right at home?" The question hung in the air between us, loaded with more meaning than the simple words could carry. This was my moment, the chance to reach out, to trust someone, to take the first step toward whatever came next. But I'd been conditioned for weeks now to be careful, to measure my words, to remember that Caleb had ears everywhere in Cotton Ridge. "I'm fine," I heard myself say, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. "Just adjusting to married life, you know how it is." But Ruthie Mae didn't move away. Instead, she stepped closer, and I caught a whiff of her perfume, something floral and warm that reminded me of my grandmother's garden. "Iris Bell," she said, and the way she used my full name made me look directly at her for the first time in weeks. "I've been married. I know what adjusting looks like, and this ain't it. You got shadows under your eyes and you jump every time someone speaks to you. That's not adjustment, honey. That's fear." Before I could respond, Caleb's voice cut across the churchyard. "Iris, we need to be getting home. The afternoon chores won't do themselves." I turned toward his voice automatically, the way I'd been trained to do, but Ruthie Mae's hand caught my arm. Her grip was gentle but firm, and when I looked back at her, she pressed something small and hard into my palm. "My address," she whispered. "You need anything, and I mean anything, you come find me. Day or night, doesn't matter. I've got a spare room and a telephone, and I don't scare easy." The paper was still clutched in my fist when we reached the farmhouse 20 minutes later. Caleb hadn't spoken during the drive, but I could feel his displeasure radiating from him like heat from a stove. It wasn't until we were inside, with the front door locked behind us, that he turned to face me. "What did Ruthie Mae want?" he asked, his voice carrying that deceptively mild tone that I'd learned to fear more than shouting. "Nothing important," I said, hoping my voice sounded steadier than I felt. "Just church auxiliary business." He studied my face for a long moment, and I forced myself to meet his gaze without flinching. Finally he nodded, apparently satisfied, and went to hang up his coat. But I caught him watching me from the corner of his eye for the rest of the afternoon, and that night when his watch chimed, there was something different in his approach. More deliberate, more focused, as if he was paying closer attention to my responses. It was then that I began to understand the true sophistication of his system. He wasn't just breaking me down randomly. He was calibrating the process, adjusting his methods based on my reactions. Like a chemist refining a formula, or a doctor adjusting a dosage. The thought made my skin crawl, but it also gave me valuable information. If he was watching me that closely, it meant he was concerned about something. Which meant I still had some power left, even if I didn't fully understand what it was. The next morning, after Caleb left for the mill, I made my way back to the sewing room and carefully removed the floorboard again. The journal I'd found was actually 2 journals bound together with a rubber band, and I'd only read through the first one. The second turned out to be Caleb's own writing, and what I found there made my blood run cold. It was a log, methodical and detailed, documenting every aspect of what he called the conditioning process. Each entry was dated and contained observations about physical and psychological changes, responses to various stimuli, and assessments of what he termed compliance levels. There were pages devoted to Eleanor, pages about Bonnie Lee, and at the very back, pages that were clearly about me. Subject demonstrates above-average intelligence and strong will, read one entry from our second week of marriage. Initial resistance higher than previous subjects. May require extended conditioning period or supplementary measures. Consult with EP regarding pharmaceutical options. EP Dr. Edwin Pike, the psychiatrist mentioned in Bonnie Lee's commitment papers. I flipped backward through the journal, looking for more references, and found them scattered throughout like breadcrumbs on a dark path. Dr. Pike wasn't just a consultant. He was a partner. The architect of a system that turned inconvenient wives into profitable patients, complete with falsified death certificates and forged commitment orders. But it was the most recent entry, dated just 3 days earlier, that made my hands shake as I read it. Subject showing signs of increased awareness. Suspicious behavior noted. Recommend acceleration of timeline. Consultation with EP scheduled for Thursday. Intake preparation to begin immediately following. Today was Tuesday, which meant I had exactly 48 hours before whatever intake preparation meant began. I spent the rest of that day in a state of controlled panic, going through the motions of my household routine while my mind raced through possibilities. Running wasn't an option. I had no money, no transportation, and nowhere to go that Caleb couldn't find me. Going to the sheriff seemed equally futile. Earl Garrison owed his position to the support of men like Caleb Thorne, and I doubted he'd take the word of a hysterical young wife over that of one of the county's most respected landowners. But I had Ruthie May's address, and more importantly, I had evidence. The photographs, the journal, the letters. All proof that something terrible was happening in Cotton Ridge. The question was how to get that evidence to someone who could act on it without getting myself committed or killed in the process. The plan that formed in my mind over the next 24 hours was born of desperation and fury in equal measure. I would document everything I could find, package it with a letter explaining the situation, and get it to Ruthie May with instructions to take it to the state authorities if anything happened to me. But I wouldn't just disappear quietly like Eleanor and Bonnie Lee had. If Caleb and Dr. Pike wanted to declare me insane, they'd have to do it in front of witnesses, with questions being asked and records being kept. Thursday morning, I watched Caleb drive away toward town for his appointment with Dr. Pike, then immediately went to work. I photographed every page of his journal using the old camera I'd found in a closet upstairs, then carefully documented the hiding place and all its contents. I wrote a detailed letter to the Missouri State Attorney General, explaining the situation and providing a complete inventory of the evidence. Everything went into a manila envelope that I sealed and addressed to Ruthie May, with a note asking her to hold it unopened unless I failed to retrieve it within a week. The hardest part was the waiting. I had no idea when Caleb would return, or what his intake preparation might involve. All I could do was go through the motions of a normal afternoon while every nerve in my body screamed with tension. I baked bread, tended the kitchen garden, mended a tear in one of his shirts. All the mundane tasks that had filled my days for the past 3 months while my husband planned my destruction. He returned just after 4 o'clock, and I could tell immediately that something had changed. His movements were more purposeful, his expression more focused. When he looked at me, it was with the clinical detachment I'd seen him use when examining sick livestock. "How are you feeling today, Iris?" he asked, hanging up his coat with his usual precision. The question was so unexpected that I almost answered honestly. Instead, I forced a smile and said, "Fine, thank you. How was your day?" "Productive," he said, and something in his tone made my skin crawl. "Very productive indeed. I think it's time we addressed some concerns that have come to my attention." He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small brown bottle, the kind pharmacists used for medications. The label was handwritten in spidery script. "For Mrs. C. Thorne. 1 teaspoon before meals as needed for nervous exhaustion. Drive E. Pike. Dr. Pike has prepared something to help with your recent difficulties," Caleb continued, setting the bottle on the kitchen table. "He's quite concerned about your well-being, Iris. As am I." I stared at the bottle, understanding instinctively that this was the beginning of the end, or the beginning of something else entirely. Whatever was in there would make me compliant, confused, easy to manipulate. Within days or weeks, I'd be exhibiting all the symptoms of someone who needed psychiatric care. And once I was committed to Dr. Pike's private wing, Iris Bell Kincaid would cease to exist in any meaningful sense. "That's very thoughtful," I managed to say, "but I'm feeling much better today. I don't think I need." "I wasn't asking what you thought you needed," Caleb interrupted. His voice still mild but with an edge that hadn't been there before. Dr. Pike's instructions were quite specific. 1 teaspoon before meals, beginning with supper tonight. I looked at the bottle, then at Caleb, then at the window that showed the long driveway leading to the main road. In that moment, I made a decision that would change everything that followed. Instead of protesting or pleading or trying to reason with him, I nodded submissively and reached for the bottle. "Of course," I said. "If Dr. Pike recommends it, then I'm sure it's for the best." The surprise that flickered across Caleb's face was so brief I might have imagined it, but it was there. He'd expected resistance, argument, perhaps even hysteria. What he got instead was apparent compliance from a woman who had just decided to stop playing the role of victim and start playing the part of bait. Because I'd realized something important during those long hours of waiting and planning. Caleb and Dr. Pike had been operating in shadows for years, preying on isolated women who disappeared without a trace. But they'd never had to deal with someone who was prepared to shine a light on their activities, even at great personal risk. That evening, as I sat at the dinner table with Caleb's medicine bottle beside my plate, I thought about Eleanor and Bonnie Lee and all the other women who might have passed through this same kitchen on their way to disappearing entirely. I thought about my sister Lydia, only 16 years old and still innocent enough to believe that marriage was about love and partnership. But mostly, I thought about the envelope I'd hidden in Ruthie May's mailbox that afternoon, and the copy of Caleb's journal that was now in the hands of someone who wouldn't hesitate to use it if I failed to retrieve it by next Thursday. The medicine tasted bitter, with an underlying sweetness that probably came from honey or syrup used to mask whatever pharmaceutical nightmare Dr. Pike had concocted. I swallowed it dutifully, then excused myself to clear the dishes while Caleb settled in his study with his evening newspaper. What he didn't know, what neither he nor Dr. Pike had considered, was that their newest victim had grown up on a farm, helping her mother tend to sick animals with a medicine cabinet full of emetics and antidotes. I'd swallowed the poisoned medicine, yes, but I'd also swallowed a carefully measured dose of ipecac syrup immediately afterward. 20 minutes later, I was quietly vomiting Dr. Pike's concoction into the toilet upstairs while Caleb read his paper downstairs, none the wiser. It wouldn't work forever. Eventually they'd notice that I wasn't showing the expected symptoms, but it would buy me time to set the next phase of my plan in motion. As I washed my mouth out and prepared for another night of lying still while Caleb slept beside me, I found myself thinking about the women in those photographs hidden beneath the floorboards. Eleanor with her wary eyes and Bonnie Lee with her incomplete smile. They'd tried to survive by being obedient, by hoping that compliance would somehow earn them mercy or freedom. I was going to try a different approach. I was going to survive by fighting back, even if it meant walking deeper into the trap before I could spring it. Because sometimes the only way out is through, and sometimes the only way to save yourself is to risk everything on the chance that other people will prove to be better than your worst experiences have taught you to expect. The grandfather clock chimed 10 o'clock, then 10:30, then 11. Soon, Caleb would wind his watch and turn off his reading lamp, and the familiar routine of night would begin. But tonight felt different, charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. Tonight I wasn't just surviving. I was preparing for war. The rain started just after midnight, a steady Missouri downpour that drummed against the farmhouse windows like nervous fingers. I lay perfectly still, listening to the rhythm of water on glass and the sound of Caleb's breathing beside me, while my mind worked through the details of what had to happen next. 3 days had passed since I'd started pretending to take Dr. Pike's medicine. 3 days of careful acting and secret planning. Time was running short, and I could feel the walls closing in. Caleb's behavior had grown increasingly strange over those 3 days. He watched me constantly now, timing my movements, asking seemingly casual questions about how I was feeling, whether I was sleeping well, if I'd noticed any changes in my appetite or mood. Each question felt like a probe, testing to see if the medication was having its intended effect. So far, my performance seemed to be convincing him, but I knew it was only a matter of time before he or Dr. Pike realized something was wrong. The breakthrough came on Friday afternoon, when I discovered Caleb's study door had been left unlocked. He'd never made that mistake before. His study was his sanctuary, filled with ledgers and contracts and all the business records that kept the Thorne empire running. I should have been more careful, should have waited, but desperation makes you take risks that logic would never approve. The room smelled like leather and pipe tobacco, with undertones of the bay rum cologne that Caleb wore like armor. His massive oak desk dominated the space, flanked by filing cabinets that probably contained half the financial secrets of Cotton Ridge. But it was the smaller items that caught my attention. A second appointment book lying open beside his regular calendar, and a locked drawer that had been left slightly ajar. The appointment book was a revelation. Page after page of coded entries that became clearer once I understood the pattern. Initials instead of full names, meeting times that didn't correspond to any legitimate business, and location notations that included Ward C and private consultation. Most damning of all were the financial notations, payments received and expenses paid out, all relating to what was clearly a thriving business built on the systematic destruction of inconvenient wives. But it was the contents of the unlocked drawer that nearly made me gasp aloud. Bottles of medication, all prescribed by Dr. Pike for various patients. Phenobarbital for sedation, chloral hydrate for sleep disorders, and several other compounds I didn't recognize but suspected were designed to produce symptoms of mental instability. There were also blank commitment forms, official-looking documents that could be filled out and filed to have someone declared legally incompetent. And tucked beneath everything else, a file folder marked IP, Phase 2. My file. Phase 2. I opened it with trembling fingers and found a complete psychological profile written in Dr. Pike's spidery handwriting. Every conversation I'd had with Caleb had been analyzed, every reaction catalogued and interpreted. According to Dr. Pike's assessment, I was highly intelligent but emotionally unstable, with narcissistic tendencies, and a propensity for elaborate fantasy construction. The recommendation was for immediate commitment before I became a danger to myself and others. The final document in the file was a commitment order, already filled out and requiring only Dr. Pike's signature and Sheriff Garrison's approval to become legally binding. According to the paperwork, I had threatened suicide multiple times, destroyed household property in violent rages, and shown increasing signs of paranoid delusion about my husband's activities. None of it was true, of course, but that didn't matter. In 1947, a woman's word against that of her husband and a respected doctor carried little weight, especially when that woman was exhibiting all the classic symptoms of mental breakdown. It was a perfect system, elegant in its simplicity and nearly impossible to challenge from the inside. I was photographing the documents with a little camera when I heard Caleb's truck turning into the driveway, 2 hours earlier than expected. Panic shot through me like electricity, but I forced myself to move carefully, methodically, replacing everything exactly as I'd found it. The camera went into my apron pocket, the drawer was pushed shut but not latched, and I was halfway back to the kitchen when I heard his boots on the front porch. "Iris!" he called as he came through the door. Where are you, dear? In the kitchen, I replied, pulling a mixing bowl from the shelf and trying to make it look like I'd been baking. I thought I'd make some cornbread for supper. He appeared in the doorway, still wearing his coat, and studied me with those calculating gray eyes. For a moment I thought he knew, thought somehow he could see the guilt written on my face, but then he smiled that cold smile and nodded approvingly. That sounds wonderful, he said. Dr. Pike stopped by the mill today. He wanted to know how you were responding to the medication. My hands continued measuring cornmeal while my mind raced. Oh, what did you tell him? That you seem more settled lately, less anxious. He was pleased to hear it. Caleb moved closer, and I could smell the bay rum and something else underneath, something medicinal and sharp. He thinks you're ready for the next phase of your treatment. The next phase. Phase 2, just like the file folder had indicated. I kept my voice steady as I asked, what kind of treatment? A brief stay at a private facility, Caleb said, watching my face carefully. Just for observation and rest. You've been under such strain lately, what with adjusting to married life and your father's illness. Dr. Pike thinks a change of environment might do you good. The lies rolled off his tongue like honey, sweet and smooth and utterly poisonous. I nodded thoughtfully, as if considering the wisdom of his suggestion, while inside I screamed with rage and terror. They were moving faster than I'd anticipated, which meant my own timeline had to accelerate. When would this happen? I asked, still measuring ingredients with steady hands. Soon, he said. Very soon. Dr. Pike is making the arrangements now. That night, after Caleb fell asleep, I made my way once again to the sewing room and carefully retrieved everything from the hiding place beneath the floorboards. The photographs, the letters, the journals. All of it went into a canvas bag that I hid beneath a loose stone in the cellar wall. If I was going to disappear like Eleanor and Bonnie Lee, I wouldn't go quietly, and I wouldn't go without leaving a trail that someone could follow. But more than that, I had decided something during those terrifying moments in Caleb's study. I couldn't just save myself. I had to try to save them too. Because if Dr. Pike's system was as elaborate as it appeared, if this had been going on for years, then Eleanor and Bonnie Lee might still be alive somewhere. Declared legally dead but actually imprisoned, forgotten by the world but not yet beyond rescue. The idea that formed over the next sleepless hours was audacious to the point of madness. Instead of trying to avoid commitment to Dr. Pike's facility, I would allow myself to be taken there, but on my own terms with my own plan, and with backup that Caleb and Pike knew nothing about. Saturday morning dawned gray and cold, with frost covering the November grass like a shroud. Caleb left early for what he said was a business meeting, and I knew without being told that he was finalizing arrangements for my transfer toward C. I had maybe 24 hours before they came for me, which meant everything had to happen today. The walk into town took 45 minutes, long enough for me to rehearse what I was going to say and steel myself for what came next. Cotton Ridge looked peaceful in the morning light. The Methodist church with its white steeple, the general store with its painted signs advertising Coca-Cola and Lucky Strike cigarettes, the neat rows of houses where decent people lived ordinary lives. It was hard to believe that such horror could exist beneath this veneer of small-town respectability. Ruthie May's house sat on Elm Street, a modest two-story with a wraparound porch and flower boxes that would be brilliant with geraniums come spring. I stood at the gate for a long moment, knowing that once I walked up that path and knocked on that door, there would be no going back. Whatever happened next, my life as Mrs. Caleb Thorne was about to end, one way or another. She answered on the second knock, wearing a flower-dusted apron and a concerned expression that deepened when she saw my face. "Iris Bell," she said, stepping aside to let me enter. "Honey, you look like you've seen a ghost. Come in, come in. Let me get you some coffee." Her kitchen was warm and welcoming, filled with the smell of fresh bread and the kind of comfortable clutter that spoke of a life fully lived. I sat at her oak table and watched her pour coffee into china cups that had probably been her grandmother's, trying to find the words to begin. "Ruthie May," I said finally, "I need your help." And I need you to believe me when I tell you something that's going to sound impossible. She set the coffee in front of me and settled into the opposite chair, her blue eyes serious and attentive. Try me. So I told her everything. About the floorboards and the photographs, about Dr. Pike and Ward C, about the medication and the commitment papers already filled out in my name. I told her about Eleanor and Bonnie Lee, about the system that turned inconvenient wives into profitable patients, about my growing certainty that other women were trapped in the same nightmare I was trying to escape. She listened without interrupting, her expression growing more grave with each revelation. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee cup as if it might contain answers to questions too terrible to ask aloud. "You have proof of this?" she asked finally. I nodded and told her about the envelope I'd left in her mailbox, about the photographs and documents I'd hidden in the cellar. She retrieved the envelope and opened it carefully, studying each item with the thoroughness of someone who understood the gravity of what she was seeing. "Dear God in heaven," she whispered, holding up the photograph of Eleanor. "This is Eleanor Whitfield. She married that Thorne man back in 35, died not 2 years later. I remember the funeral, closed casket, they said she'd been in the river too long." She looked up at me with stricken eyes. "You're telling me she might still be alive?" "I'm telling you she might be," I said. "And if she is, she's not the only one." Ruthie May set down the photograph with shaking hands. "What do you need me to do?" That was when I explained my plan. Desperate, dangerous, and absolutely necessary. I would allow myself to be committed to Ward C, but not before ensuring that people were watching, asking questions, demanding answers. If I disappeared, the evidence would go to the state authorities immediately. If I succeeded in finding Eleanor and Bonnie Lee, Ruthie May would be ready to act on whatever signal I could send. "It's too dangerous," she said immediately. "Iris, honey, if you're right about all this, those men won't hesitate to kill you if they realize what you're trying to do." "They're already planning to kill me," I replied. "Not quickly maybe, but just as surely. At least this way, I have a chance to take them down with me." We spent the rest of that morning working out details, contingencies, signals. Ruthie May would contact her nephew in Jefferson City, a newspaper reporter who specialized in investigative work. She would also speak quietly to certain members of the church congregation, people who could be trusted to ask the right questions if Mrs. Caleb Thorne suddenly needed psychiatric care. Most importantly, she would be watching. If I could get word out about what was happening inside Ward C, she would be ready to act. "There's one more thing," I said as I prepared to leave. "If this goes wrong, if I don't make it out, I need you to promise me something." She nodded, tears gathering in the corners of her eyes. "Don't let them do this to anyone else," I said. "Don't let my sister become the next Mrs. Caleb Thorne, and don't let some other young woman disappear into Ward C. Whatever it takes, whatever you have to do, stop them." She reached across the table and took my hands in hers, her grip warm and strong and surprisingly steady. "I promise you, Iris Bell Kincaid. I promise you on my husband's grave and my own soul. They will not do this to another living soul." The walk back to the farmhouse felt like a journey through a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. The familiar landscape looked different somehow, as if I was seeing it for the last time, or as if I was already becoming someone else, someone brave enough or foolish enough to walk deliberately into hell for the chance of leading others out. Caleb was waiting for me when I arrived, standing on the front porch with his pocket watch in his hand and that calculating expression that had become so familiar. He didn't ask where I'd been, and I didn't volunteer the information. We both understood that the time for pretense was nearly over. "Dr. Pike will be here tomorrow morning," he said without preamble. "He wants to examine you before making the final arrangements for your stay at the facility." "Of course," I said, climbing the porch steps with what I hoped looked like weary resignation. "Whatever he thinks is best." But as I passed him to enter the house, I caught something in his expression that hadn't been there before. A flicker of uncertainty, perhaps even doubt. For the first time since this nightmare began, Caleb Thorne wasn't entirely sure he was in control of the situation. Good, I thought. Because tomorrow, when Dr. Edwin Pike arrived to examine his latest victim, He was going to find a woman who was done being afraid, done being manipulated, and absolutely done being anyone's victim. The next phase of my education was about to begin. But this time I would be the teacher, and the lesson would be one that Cotton Ridge would never forget. Sunday morning arrived with a kind of crystalline clarity that only comes after a hard frost, the air so clean and sharp it seemed to ring like a bell when you breathed it. I stood at the kitchen window, watching the sun paint the distant hills in shades of gold and amber, and tried to memorize the view. By evening I might never see it again, at least not as Iris Bell Kincaid, the woman who had somehow found the courage to fight back. Dr. Pike arrived at exactly 10 o'clock, driving a black Packard that gleamed like a hearse in the morning light. I watched from the upstairs window as he emerged from the car, a tall, elegant man in his mid-40s with silver threading his dark hair and the kind of confident bearing that came from never having his authority questioned. He carried a leather medical bag and what looked like official papers, the tools of his particular trade. Caleb met him at the door, and their conversation was too quiet for me to overhear, but their body language spoke volumes. Pike was clearly in charge here, despite being on Caleb's property. Whatever their arrangement was, the doctor held the superior position in this partnership of predators. "Iris," Caleb called up the stairs. "Dr. Pike is here to see you." I took one last look at myself in the mirror, pale but composed, wearing my plainest dress and my grandmother's simple gold cross around my neck. Then I walked downstairs to meet the man who had orchestrated the disappearance of who knows how many women, carrying myself with all the dignity I could muster. Dr. Pike was waiting in the front parlor, seated in Caleb's favorite chair with his medical bag open on the side table. He rose when I entered, offering a smile that was probably meant to be reassuring but struck me as coldly professional, like a mortician greeting a client's family. "Mrs. Thorne," he said, his voice cultured and smooth. "I'm Dr. Pike. Your husband has asked me to evaluate your recent difficulties." "Of course, doctor," I replied, settling into the chair across from him with what I hoped looked like nervous compliance. "I appreciate you taking the time." For the next hour, Dr. Pike conducted what he probably thought was a subtle psychological examination. He asked about my sleep patterns, my appetite, my relationship with Caleb, my adjustment to married life. Every question was designed to elicit responses that could be later interpreted as symptoms of mental instability, and I gave him exactly what he was looking for. I spoke of feeling overwhelmed by my new responsibilities, of strange dreams that left me confused and frightened, of sometimes feeling like I wasn't quite myself anymore. I mentioned forgetting things, losing track of time, experiencing moments of inexplicable sadness or anxiety. All of it was true, of course. These were the natural responses of a woman being systematically drugged and psychologically tortured, but I presented them as if they were mysterious ailments that had appeared without cause. Dr. Pike took notes throughout, nodding sympathetically while his eyes remained cold and calculating. Occasionally he would glance at Caleb, who sat silent in the corner, and I could see the communication passing between them. This was going exactly according to their plan. "Mrs. Thorne," Dr. Pike said finally, closing his notepad with a decisive snap, "I believe what you're experiencing is quite serious. Left untreated, these symptoms often worsen, sometimes dramatically. I think we need to consider a period of intensive treatment in a controlled environment." "What kind of environment?" I asked, allowing just the right note of fear to creep into my voice. "A private facility where you can receive the specialized care you need," he replied smoothly. "Somewhere quiet, removed from the stresses of daily life, where we can monitor your condition closely and adjust your medication as needed." Medication. The word hung in the air like a threat, and I knew he was talking about more than the bitter liquid Caleb had been giving me. Dr. Pike had access to compounds that could reshape a person's mind, that could turn a thinking, feeling human being into a compliant shell. Whatever happened in Ward C, it began with medication. How long would I need to stay? Yes. Dr. Pike exchanged another glance with Caleb. "That's difficult to say. These conditions can be quite persistent. Months certainly. Perhaps longer. Perhaps forever," he meant. Perhaps until Iris Bell Kincaid was so thoroughly destroyed that she could never testify against anyone, never tell her story, never be anything more than another tragic case file in Dr. Pike's cabinet. But as I sat there, nodding meekly while these two monsters discussed my destruction as casually as they might discuss the weather, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not fear, not despair, but a kind of fierce, clean anger that burned through my chest like fire. They thought they had broken me, thought they had reduced me to just another victim to be processed through their system of horrors. They had no idea who they were really dealing with. When would this treatment begin? I asked, my voice small and uncertain. Today, Dr. Pike said. I have the commitment papers with me, and there's a bed available at the facility. We can have you settled by this evening. Today. No time for second thoughts, no opportunity for outside interference. They wanted me disappeared before anyone could ask too many questions or demand too many answers. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had underestimated not just me, but the network of people who were already watching, already asking those questions. I should pack some things, I said, standing on unsteady legs. Of course, Dr. Pike said graciously. Take your time. We're not in any rush. But we were, and we all knew it. This was the culmination of months of careful planning, and they wanted it executed before anything could go wrong. I went upstairs to the bedroom I had shared with Caleb, this room that had been both stage and prison for my systematic degradation, and packed a small suitcase with the clothes I would need for whatever came next. Hidden in the lining of my winter coat was a small item that neither Caleb nor Dr. Pike knew about, a device that Ruthie May's nephew had given her, something called a wire recorder that was small enough to be concealed but powerful enough to capture conversations. If I could get evidence of what was really happening in Ward C, evidence that couldn't be dismissed or explained away, it might be enough to bring down their entire operation. When I came back downstairs, Dr. Pike was completing some paperwork while Caleb signed various documents. The commitment order, no doubt, and probably financial arrangements as well. I wondered how much Dr. Pike charged for this service, how much Caleb was paying to have his inconvenient wife disappeared legally and permanently. Ready? Dr. Pike asked, closing his medical bag with a decisive click. I nodded, not trusting my voice. This was the moment of no return, the point where Iris Bell Kincaid would either save herself and others, or disappear forever into the nightmare that had claimed Eleanor and Bonnie Lee. The drive to the facility took 45 minutes, winding through countryside that grew increasingly isolated as we traveled. Dr. Pike made pleasant conversation about the weather and the changing leaves, while Caleb sat silent beside him. I stared out the window and tried to memorize landmarks, road signs, anything that might help me find my way back to the world if I survived what was coming. The Missouri State Hospital for the Insane sat on a hill overlooking the Missouri River, a massive brick complex that had housed the mentally ill for nearly 50 years. But we didn't go to the main building. Instead, Dr. Pike drove around to a smaller structure set apart from the others, connected to the main hospital by a covered walkway but clearly separate from the general population. Ward C was a 2-story brick building with barred windows and a single entrance guarded by a heavy steel door. It looked more like a prison than a hospital, which I suppose it was. Above the entrance, carved in stone, were the words "Private Treatment Facility," but there was nothing about the place that suggested healing or hope. Dr. Pike led me through the steel door and into a world that seemed to exist outside of normal time and space. The corridor was painted institutional green, lit by harsh fluorescent bulbs that cast everything in a sickly pallor. The air smelled of disinfectant and something else. Fear, perhaps, or despair given physical form. "This way, Mrs. Thorne," Dr. Pike said, his voice echoing off the painted brick walls. "Let me show you to your room." We passed other doors, all of them closed, all of them equipped with small windows that could be opened from the outside. From behind some of those doors came sounds that made my skin crawl, sobbing, wordless moaning, the kind of broken laughter that spoke of minds pushed beyond their breaking point. But from behind others came nothing at all, and somehow that silence was worse than any sound. My room was small and spare, with a narrow bed, a wooden chair, and a washstand with a cracked mirror. The single window was barred and faced away from the main road, looking out instead toward the Missouri River and the forested hills beyond. It was a room designed to contain, not comfort, and I understood that once that door closed behind me, I would be as cut off from the world as if I had died. "The nurse will be around shortly to help you get settled," Dr. Pike said, setting my suitcase on the bed. "We'll begin your evaluation tomorrow morning. I think you'll find our methods quite effective." He left me alone then, and I heard the key turn in the lock with a sound like a coffin lid closing. I was alone in Ward C, trapped in the same system that had swallowed Eleanor and Bonnie Lee, with nothing but my wits and Ruthie Mae's wire recorder to help me survive what came next. But as I sat on that narrow bed and listened to the sounds of madness echoing through the corridors, I felt something unexpected rising in my chest. Not fear, though God knows I was afraid. Not despair, though the situation seemed hopeless. What I felt was a kind of grim determination, a certainty that whatever Dr. Pike had planned for me, I was not going to go gently into that particular darkness. Somewhere in this building, Eleanor and Bonnie Lee might still be alive, still waiting for someone to remember that they were human beings with names and stories and people who loved them. Somewhere in Cotton Ridge, Ruthie Mae was waiting for my signal, ready to act on whatever evidence I could provide. And here in Ward C, Iris Bell Kincaid was about to get her education in the true nature of evil, and perhaps, if she was very clever and very lucky, her chance to strike back against the monsters who thought they could destroy women with impunity. The wire recorder was still hidden in my coat lining, and Dr. Pike's rounds would begin tomorrow morning. I had maybe 12 hours to learn the layout of this place, to figure out who was friend and who was enemy, and to start gathering the evidence that would either free us all or get me killed in the attempt. Outside my barred window, the sun was setting over the Missouri hills, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold. It was beautiful, that sunset, beautiful and terrible, and possibly the last one I would ever see as a free woman. But I was not giving up. Not yet. Not while there was still a chance to turn this trap into a snare for the trappers themselves. The night sounds of Ward C were like nothing I had ever heard before, a symphony of human suffering that seemed to seep through the brick walls and settle into my bones. Some women wept quietly, their sobs muffled by pillows or blankets. Others muttered to themselves in voices worn thin by medication and despair. From somewhere down the hall came the sound of someone scratching at their door, a rhythmic scraping that went on for hours before finally stopping. I lay on the narrow bed fully clothed, the wire recorder hidden beneath my pillow, and tried to make sense of what I was hearing. How many women were imprisoned in Ward C? How long had they been here? And most importantly, were any of them Eleanor or Bonnie Lee? Just after midnight, I heard footsteps in the corridor, soft-soled shoes moving with the careful precision of someone trying not to wake sleeping patients. Keys jingled softly, and I heard a door open somewhere nearby, followed by hushed voices speaking in tones too low to understand. Then silence, and the footsteps moving on to the next room. Night rounds, I realized. Someone was checking on the patients, or perhaps administering medication to keep them compliant through the dark hours. I pressed my ear to the door and listened as the footsteps approached my room, then passed by without stopping. Either they thought I was already asleep, or they had other plans for my first night in Ward C. Dawn came gray and cold through my barred window, revealing a view that should have been beautiful but somehow wasn't. The Missouri River wound through the valley below like a silver ribbon, and the autumn hills rolled away toward the horizon in waves of russet and gold. But there was something wrong with the perspective, something that made the landscape look flat and lifeless like a painting that had faded with age. It took me a moment to realize what it was. The window glass was thick and distorted, designed to prevent patients from seeing clearly beyond their prison. Even the view of freedom was an illusion here, a mockery of the world that existed just beyond reach. At 7 o'clock sharp, I heard keys in my lock. The door opened to reveal a thin, middle-aged woman in a starched white uniform, carrying a metal tray with what I assumed was breakfast. "Good morning," she said, her voice professionally cheerful. "I'm Nurse Hartwell. Dr. Pike asked me to check on you." She set the tray on the wooden chair, a bowl of gray porridge, a cup of weak coffee, and a small paper cup containing 2 pills. The medication, I realized. The beginning of my transformation from thinking human being to compliant patient. I'm not very hungry, I said, eyeing the pills with what I hoped looked like nervous uncertainty. You need to keep your strength up, Nurse Hartwell replied, her smile never wavering. And Dr. Pike was very specific about your medication schedule. These will help with your anxiety. I picked up the paper cup and examined the pills. One white, one pale blue, both unmarked. Whatever they were designed to make me easier to manage, more susceptible to suggestion, less able to distinguish between reality and whatever lies Dr. Pike chose to tell me. What are they for? I asked. Just something to help you relax, she said. Dr. Pike will explain everything when you see him this morning. I nodded and pretended to swallow the pills, palming them instead with a sleight of hand I'd learned as a child playing magic tricks with my father. Nurse Hartwell watched carefully, but she seemed satisfied with my performance. Dr. Pike will see you at 9 o'clock, she said, collecting the breakfast tray. Someone will come to escort you to his office. After she left, I carefully examined the pills and then hid them inside a crack in the wooden chair where I could retrieve them later. If I could collect enough of them, along with documentation of when and how they were administered, it might provide crucial evidence of the systematic drugging that was clearly part of Dr. Pike's method. At exactly 9 o'clock, the door opened again to reveal a large, silent man in orderly whites who gestured for me to follow him. We walked through corridors I hadn't seen the night before, past more locked doors and barred windows, deeper into the heart of Ward C. Dr. Pike's office was surprisingly elegant, furnished with dark wood and leather like a gentleman's study. The walls were lined with medical texts and framed diplomas, and a large window looked out toward the main hospital building. It was designed to project authority and competence, the kind of environment where a patient might feel honored to be treated by such a distinguished physician. But I noticed other details too. The way the chairs were positioned to put the patient at a psychological disadvantage, the lack of any personal items that might humanize Dr. Pike, the subtle but unmistakable scent of the same medicinal compounds I'd found in Caleb's drawer. This was a room designed for manipulation, as carefully orchestrated as a theater set. Mrs. Thorne, Dr. Pike said, rising from behind his desk with that same cold smile I remembered from yesterday. I trust you slept well. Yes, thank you, I replied, settling into the chair he indicated. Though it's all very strange being away from home. Of course. That's entirely natural. He opened a file folder, my file I realized, and consulted some notes. I've reviewed your case history with your husband, and I must say your symptoms are quite concerning. Tell me, how are you feeling this morning? For the next hour, Dr. Pike conducted what he probably considered a psychiatric evaluation. He asked about my childhood, my relationship with my parents, my feelings about marriage and domestic responsibility. Every answer I gave was carefully recorded and, I suspected, twisted to fit whatever diagnosis he had already decided upon. But I was conducting my own evaluation as well, using the time to study his methods, his mannerisms, the way he approached the systematic destruction of a human personality. And gradually, I began to understand the true sophistication of his operation. Dr. Pike wasn't just a predator. He was a scientist, conducting experiments in human psychology using vulnerable women as his test subjects. Every question was designed to elicit specific responses that could later be used to justify whatever treatment he chose to impose. He was building a case file that would support his authority to keep me here indefinitely, to drug me into compliance, to reshape my mind according to his specifications. I'm concerned about your recent behavior, he said, consulting his notes. Your husband tells me you've been making unusual accusations, creating elaborate fantasies about persecution. That suggests a paranoid ideation that could be quite dangerous if left untreated. There it was, the trap within the trap. Caleb had already provided Dr. Pike with a foundation of lies that could be used to discredit anything I might say about their activities. If I claimed they were drugging me, that would be dismissed as paranoid delusion. If I accused them of imprisoning women illegally, that would be evidence of elaborate fantasy construction. They had turned my own words against me before I'd even spoken them. I don't remember making any accusations, I said carefully. That's part of the condition, Dr. Pike replied with false sympathy. Memory disturbances, confusion about what's real and what isn't. But don't worry, Mrs. Thorne. We have very effective treatments for these symptoms. He reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a syringe, already filled with some clear liquid. This will help with your anxiety while we develop a more comprehensive treatment plan. I stared at the syringe and understood that this was the moment of truth. Whatever was in that injection would either knock me unconscious or make me so compliant that I'd be unable to resist whatever came next. Once that needle went into my arm, Iris Bell Kincaid would effectively cease to exist. I'm not feeling anxious right now, I said, scooting back in my chair. Maybe we could just talk instead. I'm afraid that's not an option, Dr. Pike replied, rising from his desk. The treatment protocol is quite specific. Please roll up your sleeve. That's when I heard it, a sound so faint I almost missed it. Someone was tapping on the wall behind Dr. Pike's office, 3 short taps followed by 3 long ones, then 3 short again. Morse code, I realized with a jolt of excitement. Someone else was alive in Ward C. Someone lucid enough to recognize what was happening and desperate enough to risk trying to communicate. Eleanor or Bonnie Lee. Or perhaps another victim I didn't even know about. Dr. Pike had heard it too, because he paused with a syringe halfway to my arm and glanced toward the wall with irritation. Construction noise from the main building, he said dismissively. Very annoying. But I could see the lie in his eyes, the flash of concern that crossed his face before he regained his composure. Someone was trying to reach me, and Dr. Pike knew exactly who it was. Doctor, I said suddenly, could I use the bathroom before we begin? I'm feeling a bit nauseated. He hesitated, clearly torn between maintaining his schedule and avoiding a mess in his office. Professional vanity won out, and he set down the syringe with obvious reluctance. Of course, he said. But we'll need to proceed with the treatment immediately when you return. The bathroom was small and windowless, but it shared a wall with whatever room the tapping had come from. I pressed my ear to the painted brick and listened intently. After a moment the tapping resumed, and this time I could make out a pattern. N-O-R, spelled out slowly in Morse code, then repeated. Estelilive. My heart hammered against my ribs as I tapped back, spelling out ris as carefully as I could. The response came immediately. Bonnieheretoo. They were both alive. Both imprisoned in Ward C. Both aware enough to recognize that someone new had arrived who might be able to help. I quickly tapped out HELP and heard Eleanor's response. DNGR. THEYKNOW. Before I could ask what they knew, I heard Dr. Pike's voice through the bathroom door. Mrs. Thorne. Is everything all right in there? Just a moment, I called back, my mind racing. Eleanor and Bonnie Lee were alive, but they were in danger, and somehow Dr. Pike was aware that something had changed. I had to find a way to document what I was learning, to get evidence out of Ward C before they silenced all of us permanently. The wire recorder was still hidden in my coat back in my room, but I wouldn't be returning there if Dr. Pike had his way. Once he injected me with whatever was in that syringe, I'd be just another broken patient in Ward C, unable to help myself or anyone else. But I had one advantage that Eleanor and Bonnie Lee hadn't had. I had people on the outside who were watching and waiting for my signal. If I could just survive long enough to get word to them, if I could document even a fraction of what was happening here, it might be enough to bring down Dr. Pike's entire operation. I returned to the office to find Dr. Pike waiting with a syringe and a look of barely controlled impatience. Feeling better? He asked, gesturing for me to return to my chair. Much thank you, I said, sitting down and rolling up my sleeve as if resigned to my fate. But as he approached with the needle, I made my decision. Dr. Pike, I said in my most innocent voice, could you explain exactly what this treatment involves? I'd like to understand what's happening to me. It was vanity that saved me. His desire to be seen as the brilliant physician rather than the monster he actually was. He couldn't resist the opportunity to display his expertise, to demonstrate his complete control over the situation. Certainly, he said, pausing with the syringe. What you're experiencing is a complex psychological condition that requires careful management. This injection contains a mild sedative that will help reduce your anxiety while we. As he spoke, I carefully reached behind my back and activated the small wire recorder I'd transferred to my waistband during my bathroom trip. Every word he said was now being captured, every admission of guilt preserved on magnetic tape. And Dr. Edwin Pike, in his arrogance and his certainty that he had already won, began to tell me exactly what he planned to do to me and why. Dr. Pike's voice took on the tone of a lecturer addressing medical students as he explained his methodology, completely unaware that every word was being recorded by the device hidden beneath my blouse. He spoke with the clinical detachment of a scientist describing a fascinating experiment, and I realized that to him, that's exactly what I was. A specimen to be studied and manipulated. The process begins with isolation, he said, still holding the syringe but clearly enjoying this opportunity to display his expertise. Remove the subject from familiar surroundings, eliminate contact with support systems, create a dependency on the institutional structure. Within weeks, most patients begin to question their own perceptions of reality. He moved to stand behind his desk, using it as a podium for his impromptu lecture. Then we introduce pharmaceutical interventions, compounds that affect memory formation, emotional regulation, cognitive function. Nothing permanent, you understand, just enough to create confusion, suggestibility. The patient begins to doubt their own memories, their own thoughts. I nodded as if fascinated by his explanation, all while my skin crawled at the casual way he described destroying human minds. How long does the process take? That depends on the individual, Dr. Pike replied, clearly pleased by what he interpreted as intellectual curiosity. Some patients respond within days. Others require months of intensive treatment. But eventually, they all reach the same endpoint, complete compliance with therapeutic recommendations. And then what happens? Yes. His smile grew colder. Then they disappear, Mrs. Thorne. Officially, they succumb to their mental illness. Suicide is common among patients with severe psychological disturbances, Very tragic but not unexpected. The family receives sympathy, the community moves on, and everyone forgets that Mrs. Eleanor Thorne or Mrs. Bonnie Lee Thorne ever existed. There it was, a complete confession captured on the wire recorder. Dr. Pike had just admitted to systematically murdering women, to falsifying death certificates, to operating what amounted to a private execution chamber disguised as a medical facility. The arrogance that had made him vulnerable had just provided me with everything I needed to destroy him. But first I had to survive long enough to get that recording into the right hands. That's fascinating, I said, hoping my voice conveyed admiration rather than the horror I actually felt. But what about the other patients? The ones who are still here? Dr. Pike's expression shifted slightly, and I saw a flicker of something that might have been caution. What makes you ask about other patients? I heard voices last night, I said carefully. It sounded like there were other women here. Are they receiving the same treatment? He studied my face for a long moment, and I could almost see him calculating, weighing whether my question represented curiosity or suspicion. Finally, he seemed to decide that I was still sufficiently naive to be trusted with partial truths. Some patients require extended care, he said. Their conditions are more resistant to treatment. But even the most difficult cases eventually respond to our methods. Could I meet them? Yes. It might be comforting to know I'm not alone in this. I'm afraid that's not possible, Dr. Pike replied, his professional mask slipping back into place. Patient interaction during the acute phase of treatment can be counterproductive. It sometimes leads to the reinforcement of delusional thinking. He moved around the desk toward me again, syringe in hand. But we've talked enough for now. Time to begin your treatment. I knew I was out of time, out of options, out of clever questions that might delay the inevitable. In moments, that needle would be in my arm, and whatever compound Dr. Pike had prepared would begin its work of unmaking my mind. The wire recorder had captured his confession, but that wouldn't matter if I became too drugged or confused to remember where I'd hidden it. That's when the fire alarm went off. The sound was deafening in the small office, a mechanical shriek that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Dr. Pike froze with a syringe halfway to my arm, his head turning toward the door in obvious alarm. Through the window, I could see smoke beginning to rise from somewhere near the main hospital building. "Damn it," he muttered, setting down the syringe. "Not today of all days." He pressed a button on his desk, and within seconds the large orderly appeared in the doorway. "What's the situation, Marcus?" Dr. Pike demanded. "Fire in the main building's kitchen, sir," Marcus replied in a voice like gravel. "They're evacuating the east wing. Fire department's on the way." Dr. Pike's face went through several expressions: irritation, calculation, then grim determination. "Take Mrs. Thorne back to her room," he instructed. "Lock her in and stay with the other patients. I need to coordinate with the main hospital staff." As Marcus gripped my arm and led me from the office, I caught Dr. Pike reaching for his telephone, no doubt calling someone to report that their schedule had been disrupted. But I was barely listening to his conversation, because my mind was racing with possibilities. The fire, if it was really a fire, might provide the chaos I needed to find Eleanor and Bonnie Lee, to document their condition, to gather more evidence of Dr. Pike's crimes. Or it might be something else entirely. The timing seemed almost too convenient, and I found myself wondering if Ruthie May had somehow arranged this distraction. Marcus escorted me through corridors that were now filled with activity. Orderlies hurried back and forth, nurses moved between rooms with clipboards and keys, and from behind the locked doors came increased agitation as patients responded to the alarm and the unusual commotion. Through the windows, I could see fire trucks arriving at the main hospital, their red lights painting the gray morning in violent color. But instead of taking me directly back to my room, Marcus made a detour that took us past a section of Ward C I hadn't seen before. Here, the corridors were quieter, the doors fewer and farther apart. These weren't regular patient rooms, they were something else entirely. We paused at one of these doors while Marcus fumbled with his keys, and I heard it again, the tapping from behind the wall. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. But this time it wasn't coming from just one room. I could hear similar patterns coming from at least 3 different locations, all tapping in the same desperate rhythm. "What's that noise?" I asked Marcus, trying to sound confused rather than alert. He glanced toward the doors with what might have been discomfort. "Old building," he said gruffly. "Pipes settling. Nothing to worry about." But I could see in his eyes that he knew exactly what the tapping meant, and it troubled him. Marcus might be complicit in Dr. Pike's system, but he wasn't entirely comfortable with it. That knowledge might prove useful if I could find a way to exploit it. My room felt smaller when I returned to it, more confining, as if the walls had moved closer together while I was gone. Marcus locked the door behind me and took up a position in the hallway where I could see his shadow through the small window. I was effectively under guard now, my movements restricted even more than they had been before. But I still had the wire recorder, and more importantly, I now knew where Eleanor and Bonnie Lee were being held. The corridor Marcus had led me through housed the long-term patients, the women who had been declared dead to the world but were still alive in Dr. Pike's private laboratory. If I could find a way to reach them to document their condition, it would provide irrefutable proof of the crimes being committed in Ward C. The fire alarm continued to blare throughout the morning, though the smoke I could see from my window seemed to be lessening. Whether the emergency was real or manufactured, it had disrupted Dr. Pike's careful schedule and created opportunities that might not come again. I spent the next several hours listening to the sounds of the building, learning the patterns of movement in the corridors, trying to map the layout of Ward C in my mind. Twice I heard Dr. Pike's voice in the hallway, speaking in urgent, hushed tones to someone I couldn't see. Once I caught fragments of a conversation that made my blood run cold. "Can't afford any more delays," I heard him say. "The Thorne woman is already asking too many questions. If she makes contact with the others." The response was too quiet to understand, but Dr. Pike's reply was clear enough. Then we accelerate the timeline. Tonight if necessary. I won't risk exposure over one patient. Tonight. Whatever Dr. Pike had planned for me was going to happen tonight, regardless of whether the fire emergency had been resolved. I had maybe 6 hours to find Eleanor and Bonnie Lee, gather evidence, and somehow get word to the outside world about what was happening in Ward C. The afternoon stretched endlessly, marked only by the diminishing sound of fire trucks and the gradual return to normal activity in the building. A different nurse brought me lunch, the same gray porridge and weak coffee, accompanied by the same 2 pills that I palmed and added to my growing collection. If nothing else, I would have physical evidence of the systematic drugging that was part of Dr. Pike's methodology. As evening approached, I heard increased activity in the corridor outside my room. Footsteps, quiet conversations, the sound of equipment being moved. Whatever was planned for tonight was already being prepared, and I suspected it involved more than just my continued treatment. Just after sunset, the fire alarm fell silent for the first time all day, and the sudden quiet was almost as startling as the original noise had been. In that silence, I could hear something new, the sound of vehicles arriving outside Ward C, engines that didn't belong to fire trucks or ambulances. I pressed my face to the barred window and caught a glimpse of 2 black sedans parked near the entrance to Ward C. Official-looking cars with government license plates, the kind that might belong to state health inspectors or law enforcement officers. Or they might belong to Dr. Pike's associates, people who helped cover up the crimes committed in Ward C and dispose of the evidence when necessary. Given the urgency I'd heard in his voice earlier, I suspected the latter. That's when I heard the tapping again, more insistent now, coming from multiple directions. Eleanor and Bonnie Lee and whoever else was imprisoned in the long-term ward had heard the vehicles too, and they understood what their arrival meant. Time was running out for all of us. I pulled the wire recorder from its hiding place and checked the tape. There was still recording time left, enough to capture more evidence if I could find a way to use it. But first, I had to find a way out of this locked room and into the corridor where the real secrets of Ward C were hidden. The solution came from an unexpected source. Marcus himself. Just after full dark, I heard him talking to someone in the hallway, his voice carrying clearly through the door. "Don't like it," he was saying. "That Thorne woman, she's not like the others. Martyr. More aware. This whole thing feels wrong." "Orders are orders," came the reply in a voice I didn't recognize. "Dr. Pike wants it done tonight, all 3 of them. Clean and quiet, no loose ends. All 3 of them. They weren't just planning to eliminate me. They were going to kill Eleanor and Bonnie Lee as well, probably making it look like a tragic multiple suicide or perhaps an accident during the confusion caused by the fire. Dr. Pike was cleaning house, removing all evidence of his crimes along with the witnesses who could testify against him. But Marcus was uncomfortable with it, and that discomfort might be my only chance for survival. I moved to the door and tapped gently on the small window until I got his attention. "Please," I whispered when he approached. "I need to speak with you. It's important." He glanced around the hallway, then unlocked the door and stepped inside, closing it behind him but not locking it again. Up close, I could see the conflict in his face, the struggle between professional duty and personal conscience. "I know what's happening here," I said quietly. "I know about Eleanor and Bonnie Lee, about the women who disappeared. And I know that tonight, Dr. Pike plans to kill us all to cover his tracks." Marcus's face went pale, but he didn't deny my accusations. "You don't understand," he said. "This is bigger than just Dr. Pike. There are important people involved, people who won't let this operation be exposed. Fighting it will just get you killed faster." "Maybe," I said. "But I'd rather die trying to save innocent women than live knowing I let them be murdered." "Wouldn't you?" For a long moment, Marcus stared at me without speaking. Then he sighed, a sound like air leaking from a punctured tire. "What do you want from me?" 5 minutes, I said. 5 minutes in that long-term corridor, long enough to document what's really happening to those women. That's all I need. "And then what?" he asked. "Even if you get evidence, who's going to believe you? Who's going to act on it?" People are already watching, I told him. People who will ask questions if I disappear without explanation. But they need proof, something concrete that can't be explained away or covered up. Marcus studied my face, perhaps looking for deception, perhaps looking for courage. Whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him, because he nodded slowly. 5 minutes, he said. But after that you're on your own. I can't protect you from what's coming. He led me out of the room and down the corridor toward the long-term ward, his keys jingling softly in the darkness. Behind us, Ward C was settling into its nighttime routine, but I could feel the tension in the air, the sense of impending catastrophe that comes when terrible plans are set in motion. We were halfway to the long-term corridor when I heard Dr. Pike's voice echoing from his office, speaking to someone on the telephone. His words made my blood freeze in my veins. Yes, I understand the timeline, he was saying. The Thorn woman will suffer a psychotic break tonight, unfortunately fatal. Very tragic, but these things happen in psychiatric facilities. The family will be notified, the body will be cremated per health regulations, and the matter will be closed. My obituary, spoken aloud with the casual indifference of a man ordering supplies. But as horrifying as those words were, they also filled me with a fierce determination to ensure that Dr. Edwin Pike's predictions would not come to pass. Eleanor and Bonnie Lee were waiting in their private hell, and I was going to find them. Whatever happened after that, at least they would know that someone had tried to remember their names, to bear witness to their suffering, to carry their stories back to the world of the living. The wire recorder pressed against my ribs with each heartbeat, ready to capture whatever truths lay hidden in the long-term ward of Dr. Pike's House of Horrors. The long-term corridor was a different world from the rest of Ward C, painted in darker colors and lit with bulbs so dim they cast more shadows than light. The air itself felt heavier here, thick with the weight of abandoned hope and forgotten names. Marcus moved ahead of me like a ghost, his keys muffled in his hand to prevent any sound that might alert Dr. Pike to our presence. "Third door on the left," he whispered, stopping before a metal door that looked identical to all the others except for the small nameplate that read E. Whitfield. Eleanor's maiden name, I realized. They hadn't even bothered to acknowledge her married identity in this place where she was supposed to be dead. Marcus hesitated with his hand on the lock, and I could see the conflict still raging in his face. "Once I open this door," he said quietly, "there's no going back for any of us. You understand that, don't you?" I nodded, my throat too tight with emotion to speak. Through the small window, I could see movement in the darkness beyond. Someone alive, someone waiting, someone who had been declared dead to the world but who had somehow survived 12 years in this nightmare. The key turned with a soft click, and the door swung open to reveal a room that was both more and less than I had expected. It was larger than my own cell, with a real bed instead of a narrow cot, a small table with books and papers, even a few personal belongings arranged on wooden shelves. But the windows were not just barred, they were painted black, blocking out any view of the outside world. And there, rising from the chair where she had been reading by lamplight, was Eleanor Whitfield Thorne. She was older than in her wedding photograph, of course, her dark hair now streaked with silver and her face marked by lines that spoke of years of suffering. But her eyes were still alive, still intelligent, still burning with the fire of someone who had refused to let her captors break her spirit entirely. "Mrs. Thorne," she said, and her voice was steady despite the tremor I could see in her hands. "I've been waiting for you." I stared at her, this woman who was supposed to be dead, who had been mourned and buried and forgotten by everyone except the monster who kept her imprisoned here. "Eleanor," I whispered. "My God, they said you were dead. They had a funeral." "I was at my own funeral," she replied with bitter irony. Dr. Pike made sure I knew about it. He likes his patients to understand exactly how thoroughly they've been erased from existence. She moved closer, and I could see the careful way she carried herself, the subtle signs of someone who had learned to live with chronic pain. "What did they do to you?" I asked. "Everything," she said simply. "But I survived, and I remembered, and I kept my mind intact despite their best efforts to shatter it. Because I knew someone would come eventually. Someone like you." Marcus shifted nervously in the doorway, glancing back toward the main corridor. "We don't have much time," he warned. "Dr. Pike's rounds start in 10 minutes. Eleanor heard him and nodded grimly. "Then we need to move quickly. Bonnie Lee is 2 doors down. She's not as strong as I am, but she's alive. And there are others, women whose names you've never heard because their disappearances were never reported, never investigated." "How many others?" I asked, even as I activated the wire recorder to capture her words. 6, as of last count," Eleanor replied. 6 women who walked into Dr. Pike's trap and never walked out. He keeps us alive because we're too valuable to kill, living proof of his methods, test subjects for new compounds, examples he can point to when training others in his techniques. The horror of it crashed over me like a physical blow. This wasn't just about eliminating inconvenient wives. This was a laboratory, a place where Dr. Pike perfected his methods of psychological destruction before selling those techniques to others. Every woman imprisoned here was both victim and unwilling teacher in a curriculum of human degradation. "We have to document this," I said, holding up the wire recorder. "We need evidence that can't be denied or explained away." Eleanor's eyes lit up with something approaching hope. "I've been keeping records," she said, moving to the small table where her papers were arranged. Names, dates, treatments administered, everything I could observe or overhear. 12 years of documentation, waiting for someone who could use it. She handed me a notebook filled with her careful handwriting, page after page of observations, testimonies, proof of crimes that stretched back more than a decade. As I flipped through the pages, I saw names I recognized from newspaper obituaries, women who had supposedly died of various causes but who had actually been murdered in Ward C. "Take it," Eleanor said. "Get it out of here, get it to someone who can act on it. But first you need to see Bonnie Lee. She needs to know that someone from the outside world still remembers her name." We moved quickly to the next cell, where Marcus's keys revealed another living ghost. Bonnie Lee was smaller than her photograph had suggested, fragile-looking in the way of someone who had been systematically undermined for years. But when she saw me, her face lit up with a smile that was both heartbreaking and beautiful. "You're real," she whispered, reaching out to touch my hand as if to confirm my solid existence. "Sometimes I dream that people come to rescue us, but they always turn out to be hallucinations. But you're real." "I'm real," I confirmed, gripping her hand tightly. "And I'm going to get you out of here. Both of you." But even as I spoke the words, I could hear footsteps in the main corridor, moving with the measured pace of Dr. Pike's nightly rounds. Marcus heard them too, his face going pale with fear. "We have to go," he hissed. "Now, before he finds us here." I looked at Eleanor, then at Bonnie Lee, then at the notebook filled with evidence that could destroy Dr. Pike's entire operation. There wasn't time to rescue them tonight. Even if we could somehow overpower the guards and escape the building, where would we go? How would we survive long enough to reach the authorities? But there was time to ensure that their stories would be told, that their suffering would not be forgotten, that justice would eventually come for the man who had stolen their lives. "I'll be back," I promised them both. "I swear to you, I will not leave you here. But I need to get this evidence to people who can help us." Eleanor nodded understanding, but Bonnie Lee clung to my hand with desperate strength. "Please don't leave us," she begged. "Please don't let them keep us here forever." The footsteps in the corridor were getting closer, and I could hear Dr. Pike's voice speaking to someone about the evening schedule. In moments, he would discover our unauthorized visit, and any chance of exposing his crimes would be lost forever. "Trust me," I told Bonnie Lee, gently freeing my hand from her grip. "Trust that there are people in the world who still care what happens to you, who will fight for your freedom even when you can't fight for it yourself." Marcus was already locking Bonnie Lee's door, his hands shaking with urgency. We moved quickly back toward my own cell, but as we rounded the corner into the main corridor, we came face to face with Dr. Pike himself. He stopped dead in his tracks, his pale eyes taking in the scene. Marcus with his keys, me out of my locked room, the obvious signs that we had been somewhere we weren't supposed to be. For a moment, nobody moved, nobody spoke, as if we were all frozen in a tableau of guilt and discovery. Then Dr. Pike smiled, and it was the coldest expression I had ever seen on a human face. "Mrs. Thorne," he said pleasantly. "Out for an evening stroll, I see. How unfortunate." He turned to Marcus, and his voice took on a tone of disappointed authority. "I'm surprised at you, Marcus. After all these years of faithful service, I never expected such a lapse in judgment." Marcus straightened to his full height, and I saw something change in his expression, fear giving way to a kind of grim resolve. "Maybe I got tired of being part of something evil," he said quietly. Dr. Pike's smile never wavered, but his hand moved to his coat pocket and withdrew something small and metallic. A scalpel, I realized with a chill of terror. He had come prepared for violence, expecting resistance, ready to eliminate any obstacles to his plans. "Evil is such a subjective term," he said, testing the blade's edge with his thumb. "I prefer to think of it as necessary work. Difficult, sometimes unpleasant, but ultimately beneficial to society. Some people simply aren't equipped for the complexities of modern life, Mrs. Thorne. We provide them with a peaceful alternative." "You provide them with murder," I replied, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "You steal their lives, their identities, their very existence. That's not medicine, Dr. Pike. That's monstrous." He took a step closer, the scalpel catching the dim corridor light like a sliver of captured starlight. "You're exhibiting classic symptoms of paranoid delusion," he said with false concern. "Elaborate conspiracy theories, aggressive behavior toward medical staff, inability to distinguish between reality and fantasy. Very sad, really. The family will be devastated to learn how quickly your condition deteriorated." But as he raised the scalpel, as he prepared to add my name to his long list of victims, something unexpected happened. The lights in Ward C went out, plunging us into complete darkness. And in that darkness came the sound I had been praying to hear all evening. The sound of doors being kicked in, of authoritative voices shouting orders, of boots on stairs and keys rattling in locks. The cavalry had finally arrived, summoned by evidence I hadn't even known existed, guided by signals I hadn't realized I was sending. "This is the Missouri State Police," came a voice from the main entrance. "Everyone remain where you are. This facility is now under investigation." In the confusion that followed, shouts, running footsteps, the beam of flashlights cutting through the darkness, I heard Dr. Pike curse under his breath and felt rather than saw him lunge toward me with the scalpel. But Marcus was faster, tackling the doctor and sending them both crashing into the corridor wall. I pressed myself against the opposite wall and clutched Eleanor's notebook to my chest, listening to the sounds of Dr. Pike's empire finally crumbling around him. Somewhere in the darkness, keys were turning in locks that had been sealed for years, and women who had been declared dead were blinking in the sudden light of flashlights, alive and real and ready to tell their stories to anyone who would listen. The wire recorder was still running, still capturing every word, every sound, every moment of this long-awaited reckoning. By morning, the world would know what had happened in Ward C. By morning, the names of Eleanor and Bonnie Lee and all the others would be restored to the land of the living. And Dr. Edwin Pike would finally face judgment for his crimes against the most vulnerable members of society. Judgment that was long overdue and absolutely deserved. The interrogation room at the Missouri State Police headquarters in Jefferson City was nothing like the sterile elegance of Dr. Pike's office. Bare walls, a wooden table scarred by years of use, and chairs that had heard countless confessions and denials. But it was here, 12 hours after the raid on Ward C, that the full scope of Dr. Pike's operation finally came to light. I sat across from Detective Raymond Morrison, a weathered man in his 50s who had spent the night collecting statements from the women liberated from Ward C. Eleanor's notebook lay open on the table between us, its pages marked with evidence tags and photographers' labels. The wire recorder had been taken as evidence hours ago, its magnetic tape now being transcribed by stenographers who would preserve every damning word Dr. Pike had spoken in his moment of arrogant confession. 16 women, Detective Morrison said, consulting his own notes. 16 women who were declared legally dead but were actually imprisoned in that facility. Some for as long as 15 years. He looked up at me with eyes that had seen too much evil to be surprised by anything, but which still held a flicker of amazement at the sheer scope of the crimes we had uncovered. Mrs. Kincaid, I've been investigating criminal cases for 23 years, and I've never seen anything quite like this. Through the window, I could see the early morning sun painting the Missouri hills in shades of gold and amber, the same view I had tried to memorize from my cell window, thinking I might never see freedom again. But now I was here, alive and free and surrounded by people who believed my story, who were acting on the evidence I had helped gather. What about Dr. Pike? Yes. Detective Morrison's expression hardened. In custody, along with 3 associates and 4 orderlies from Ward C. He's claiming everything was legitimate psychiatric treatment, authorized by state health officials, properly documented according to medical standards. But his story's falling apart pretty quickly when confronted with the evidence you and Mrs. Whitfield provided. Eleanor. The thought of her filled me with both hope and concern. How are the women who were imprisoned? Are they going to be all right? Physically, most of them are in better condition than we expected, Morrison replied. Pike kept them healthy because he needed them functional for his experiments. Psychologically, that's going to take time. Years maybe. But they're alive, Mrs. Kincaid. They're alive because of what you did. The praise made me uncomfortable. I hadn't felt heroic during those terrifying hours in Ward C. I had felt scared, desperate, often hopeless. But perhaps heroism wasn't about feeling brave. Perhaps it was about acting despite the fear, about choosing to fight even when the odds seemed impossible. What happens now? Yes. Now we build the prosecution case, Morrison said, closing Eleanor's notebook with a decisive snap. Pike and his associates are going to face federal charges. Kidnapping, fraud, conspiracy, probably murder in the cases where women actually died in his custody. But first, we need to understand how this operation worked. Who funded it? Who else was involved? That last question had been haunting me since the raid. Dr. Pike's facility had operated for more than 15 years, serving clients across multiple states. Someone had been paying him. Someone had been covering up his crimes. Someone had been ensuring that questions weren't asked when inconvenient wives disappeared. Caleb, I said suddenly. Caleb Thorne and the other husbands. They weren't just clients. They were part of the system. Morrison nodded grimly. We arrested Thorne at his farmhouse early this morning. Found enough evidence in his study to charge him as a co-conspirator. Apparently, he wasn't just disposing of his own wives. He was recruiting other men with similar problems, collecting referral fees from Pike for each new patient delivered. The scope of it made me feel sick. This hadn't been the isolated evil of one twisted doctor. It had been a network, a business, a systematic operation that turned the most vulnerable moments of women's lives into profit opportunities for predatory men. How many others? Yes. We're still investigating, but preliminary evidence suggests at least 30 men across 4 states were involved as clients or recruiters. Some of the imprisoned women were married to repeat offenders, men who had already disposed of previous wives through Pike's services. 30 men. Hundreds of women. Decades of crimes hidden beneath the veneer of medical authority and legal process. The magnitude of it was staggering, but it also explained how Pike had been able to operate for so long without detection. When the system itself is corrupted, when the people in authority are complicit in the crimes, victims have nowhere to turn for help. Except sometimes, if they're very lucky, they find allies in unexpected places. Detective Morrison, I said, there's someone I need to thank. A woman named Ruthie Mae Talbot in Cotton Ridge. If it hadn't been for her. Already on it, Morrison interrupted with a slight smile. Mrs. Talbot has been very helpful in our investigation. In fact, she's the reason we found Ward C when we did. What do you mean? Morrison consulted his notes again. When you didn't retrieve that envelope she was holding for you, she contacted her nephew at the Kansas City Star. He started making inquiries, which led to questions being asked at the state health department. When they couldn't find any record of a legitimate private psychiatric facility associated with Dr. Pike, they called us. So Ruthie May had kept her promise, had acted exactly as we had planned. The network of protection we had built around my desperate mission had worked exactly as intended, providing the backup that made survival possible. The fire at the main hospital, I said suddenly. Was that Mrs. Talbot again? Morrison confirmed. Her nephew arranged for a controlled burn in the hospital kitchen's grease trap, enough to trigger the fire department response and create the confusion you needed, but not enough to endanger any patients. Clever woman. Clever plan. I sat back in the hard wooden chair, overwhelmed by the realization of how many people had risked themselves to save women they had never met. Ruthie May, her nephew, Detective Morrison and his team, even Marcus. All of them choosing to act when action was dangerous, choosing to care when indifference would have been safer. Mrs. Kincaid, Detective Morrison said, leaning forward across the scarred table. There's something else I need to ask you about. Something we found in Pike's office that doesn't fit the pattern of his other crimes. He pulled out a file folder I recognized, the one marked IBK Phase 2 that I had discovered in Caleb's study. But now it contained additional documents, papers I hadn't seen before. Pike wasn't just planning to eliminate you, Morrison continued. He was planning to use your case as a demonstration, a training exercise for other doctors he was recruiting to expand his operation. Your murder was supposed to be filmed, documented, used as instructional material for a network of facilities across the country. The words hit me like a physical blow. Not only had I been marked for death, but my death was supposed to be a teaching tool, a way to spread Pike's methods to other predators in other states. How many more women would have suffered if his expansion plans had succeeded? But they didn't succeed, I said, as much to myself as to Morrison. The network is broken, the methods are exposed, and the people responsible are going to face justice. Yes, Morrison agreed. Thanks to you. Through the window, I could see people going about their normal lives, walking to work, buying newspapers, talking and laughing as if the world hadn't just been revealed to contain horrors beyond their imagination. And maybe that was how it should be. Maybe the fact that ordinary life could continue was proof that good had triumphed over evil, that the system could still work when people of conscience demanded justice. But I also knew that the women who had survived Ward C would carry scars from their imprisonment for the rest of their lives. Eleanor, Bonnie Lee, and all the others would need years of care and support to rebuild their shattered identities, to reconnect with families who thought they were dead, to find their place in a world that had moved on without them. That afternoon, I walked out of the Jefferson City police station into a world that looked exactly the same as it had a week ago but felt completely different. The autumn air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves. Somewhere, a church bell was ringing the hour, and the sound reminded me of Cotton Ridge, of Sunday mornings when the worst thing I had to worry about was whether my apple butter would win first prize at the county fair. Ruthie May was waiting for me by her nephew's car, her face lined with worry and relief in equal measure. When she saw me, she opened her arms, and I walked into her embrace like a child coming home after a long and terrible journey. "It's over," she said simply, and I could hear tears in her voice. "It's finally over." But even as I stood there in the safety of her arms, I knew it wasn't really over. It would never be completely over for the women who had suffered, for the families who had mourned loved ones who weren't actually dead, for the communities that had trusted authorities who had betrayed that trust. The legal proceedings would take months, maybe years. There would be trials and testimony, appeals and investigations. The full scope of Dr. Pike's network would have to be unraveled, and every man who had participated in his crimes would have to face justice. And somewhere, in other states and other communities, there might be other Dr. Pikes operating other facilities, preying on other vulnerable women who had no one to speak for them. But that was work for tomorrow, and for other people who would take up the fight where I had left off. Today, I was alive and free and surrounded by people who had proven that ordinary human decency could triumph over the most sophisticated evil. Today that was enough. 5 years later, I stood on the front porch of a house that had never known the sound of violence or the weight of fear. The afternoon sun slanted through the oak trees I had planted the year after moving to Springfield, casting dancing shadows on the wooden boards I had painted myself in cheerful yellow. From inside came the sound of women's voices, laughter mixed with serious conversation, the comfortable noise of people who had found safety after long periods of danger. The Iris Bell House, they called it now, though I had tried to name it something else. A place where women could come when they had nowhere else to go, when they were running from husbands or families or systems that treated them as property rather than people. We had 6 bedrooms, a kitchen large enough for communal meals, and a sitting room where stories were shared and healing began. Eleanor lived here now, helping to run the daily operations while slowly rebuilding a life that had been stolen from her for 12 years. Her hair was completely silver now, and her hands still trembled sometimes, but her eyes were clear and her voice was strong when she spoke to the women who came to us desperate and afraid. Bonnie Lee had returned to her family in Arkansas, though she visited often and wrote letters that we read aloud during our evening gatherings. Her youngest sister, who had been only 8 when Bonnie disappeared, was now married with children of her own. The reunion had been difficult, explaining 11 years of absence, rebuilding relationships that had been severed by grief. But Bonnie's family had welcomed her back with the fierce joy of people given a miracle they had stopped believing in. Not all the women from Ward C had been so fortunate. 2 had died in the years since the raid, their bodies finally succumbing to the damage inflicted by Pike's treatments, their spirits finally giving up the fight they had sustained for so long. But 14 had survived, had found their way back to some version of life, had learned to exist in a world that remembered them as dead. The trials had lasted 2 years. Dr. Edwin Pike had been sentenced to death, though he died of a heart attack in prison before the sentence could be carried out. Caleb Thorne and his associates had received life sentences, their appeals exhausted, their names forever associated with one of the most heinous criminal conspiracies in Missouri history. But the real victory wasn't in the courtrooms or the newspaper headlines. It was here in this house, in the lives that had been rebuilt from the fragments Pike had tried to destroy. It was in Eleanor's laugh when she taught young women how to balance a budget or negotiate with landlords. It was in the letters from Bonnie Lee describing her nephew's first steps and her sister's wedding. It was in the knowledge that the system Dr. Pike had created, the network of complicit doctors and corrupt officials and predatory husbands, had been exposed and dismantled, its methods revealed to the world in testimony that could never be taken back or covered up. This afternoon we were hosting a special visitor. Detective Morrison, now retired, had driven down from Jefferson City to attend what had become an annual gathering, a memorial service for the women who hadn't survived, and a celebration of life for those who had. As I watched him climb the porch steps, I was struck by how much he had aged in the 5 years since that interrogation room conversation. His hair was completely gray now, his face marked by lines that spoke of too many cases, too much knowledge of what people could do to each other when they thought no one was watching. "Mrs. Kincaid," he said, shaking my hand with the same firm grip I remembered. "The house looks wonderful. Eleanor's done amazing work with the garden." "She has a gift for making things grow," I replied, leading him into the sitting room where the others were gathering. "I think it comes from having been buried alive for so long. She understands the value of light." The women who lived with us now came from all over Missouri and the surrounding states. Some were escaping abusive marriages, others were recovering from different kinds of trauma, a few were simply women who needed a safe place to figure out what came next in their lives. We asked no questions beyond what they chose to share, imposed no requirements beyond basic respect for others, offered no promises beyond safety and support for as long as they needed it. Eleanor appeared in the doorway, wearing the simple blue dress that had become her uniform and carrying a tray of the tea cakes she made every Tuesday. At 62, she moved with the careful grace of someone who had learned to appreciate every moment of freedom, every choice she was allowed to make. "Detective Morrison," she said warmly, "I'm so glad you could come. The others are eager to meet you. Some of them weren't ready to talk to police officers 5 years ago, but time changes everything." We spent the afternoon sharing stories, reading letters from women who had moved on to other lives, looking at photographs of children and grandchildren who would grow up never knowing how close their mothers had come to disappearing forever. Detective Morrison listened with the patient attention of someone who understood the importance of bearing witness, of remembering the names and faces that others had tried to erase. As evening approached, we moved to the back garden where Eleanor had planted a memorial grove. 14 oak trees for the women who had been found alive in Ward C, and smaller flowering trees for those who had died either in Pike's custody or in the years since. Each tree had a small bronze plaque with a name, a birth date, and the words, "Never forgotten." "I keep thinking about the ones we didn't find," Eleanor said quietly as we stood among the trees. "The women who disappeared before I arrived at Ward C, or after I stopped keeping detailed records. Pike operated for more than 15 years. There had to be others." Morrison nodded grimly. "We've identified 12 additional victims from his earlier operations, but their remains were never recovered. Pike was thorough about disposal, especially in the beginning when he was still developing his methods. The thought of those lost women still haunted me. Names that would never be recovered, stories that would never be told, families that would never know what had happened to daughters and sisters and mothers who had simply vanished one day and never come home. But we had saved who we could save, remembered who we could remember, and created something positive from the wreckage of Pike's crimes. The Iris Bell House had helped more than 100 women over the past 5 years, providing them with the resources and support they needed to rebuild their lives on their own terms. Some stayed for weeks, others for months. A few had become permanent residents, finding in our little community the family they had never had or had lost along the way. But all of them left with something they hadn't had when they arrived. The knowledge that they mattered, that their stories were worth telling, that they deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. As the sun set behind the memorial grove, casting long shadows across the garden Eleanor had coaxed from empty ground, I found myself thinking about that night in Ward C when I had promised Eleanor and Bonnie Lee that I would come back for them. It had taken longer than any of us had expected, and the rescue had come in a different form than I had imagined, but I had kept that promise. They were free. They were remembered. They were surrounded by people who understood their value not as possessions to be controlled or problems to be eliminated, but as human beings with inherent worth and dignity. "Mrs. Kincaid," Detective Morrison said as the gathering began to break up, "I hope you know what you accomplished. Not just in exposing Pike's operation, but in this." He gestured toward the house, the garden, the women saying good night to each other with the easy familiarity of family. "This is what justice looks like. Not just punishment for the guilty, but healing for the survivors." I watched Eleanor help one of our newest residents, a young woman named Sarah who had arrived 2 weeks ago with nothing but the clothes on her back and a black eye that was just beginning to fade. I watched them work together to water the newly planted roses along the back fence. Eleanor's hands were steady as she showed Sarah how to check the soil moisture, how to deadhead the spent blooms, how to nurture something beautiful back to life. "I learned something important during those days in Ward C," I told Morrison. "Evil thrives in isolation, in silence, in the spaces where nobody is watching or asking questions. But it can't survive transparency. It can't withstand the light of truth, or the power of people who refuse to look away when others are suffering." Morrison nodded thoughtfully. "Is that why you never remarried? Why you've devoted your life to this work?" I considered the question, watching the last light fade from the sky above our little sanctuary. "I think I learned that there are different kinds of love," I said finally. "There's the kind that seeks to possess, to control, to diminish the beloved until they become an extension of the lover's will. And then there's the kind that seeks to liberate, to empower, to help the beloved become the fullest version of themselves." I gestured toward the house, where lights were coming on in windows and the sound of evening conversations drifted out into the garden. "This is love too. Maybe not the kind the poets write about, but real and valuable and necessary. The love that says you matter, you belong, you deserve to be safe and free and happy." As Morrison prepared to leave, he shook my hand once more and said something that stayed with me long after his car disappeared down the tree-lined street. "Mrs. Kincaid, I've seen a lot of darkness in my career. But I've also learned that the measure of a society isn't how it treats its most powerful members. It's how it treats its most vulnerable ones. What you've built here, what you've done for these women, that's the measure of who we can be at our best." Later that night, after the house had settled into its peaceful evening rhythm, I sat on the front porch with a cup of Eleanor's chamomile tea and listened to the sound of the wind in the oak trees. From somewhere in the distance came the sound of a train whistle, not the harsh blast of a freight train like the one that had masked my escape from Dr. Pike's office, but the gentle call of a passenger train carrying people to new destinations, new possibilities, new lives. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new women seeking shelter, new stories of survival and recovery. There would be phone calls from social workers and police officers, meetings with local officials and fellow advocates, the endless administrative work that kept our little sanctuary running. But tonight there was peace. Tonight, 16 women slept safely under a roof that would never echo with violence or fear. Tonight, Eleanor would not dream of locked doors and painted black windows, but of gardens and grandchildren and all the ordinary miracles that make up a life freely lived. And somewhere in the darkness beyond our porch light, other women who needed help would know that there were places like this one, people like us, networks of support that could catch them when they fell and help them find their footing on solid ground. The Iris Bell House was just one small light in a world that still harbored too much darkness. But it was our light, tended by hands that remembered what it felt like to live without hope, kept burning by hearts that refused to accept cruelty as inevitable or injustice as permanent. As I wound my grandfather's pocket watch, the one I had bought from Caleb Thorne's estate auction, reclaimed as a reminder rather than a trophy, I listened to its steady tick marking the passage of time that belonged to us now, time that was ours to spend on healing and hope and the patient work of making the world a little bit safer for the women who needed safety most. The greatest victory, I had learned, wasn't in the signing of commitment papers or the slamming of prison doors. It was in this, the knowledge that love could triumph over hatred, that courage could overcome fear, and that even in the darkest places, there were people willing to light candles rather than curse the darkness. The honeysuckle was blooming again, heavy and sweet in the Missouri night, and its fragrance carried on the wind like a promise that spring always follows winter, that hope always survives despair, and that every ending is also a beginning for someone brave enough to write the next chapter of their story. My name is Iris Bell Kincaid, and this is what I learned in the shadows of Cotton Ridge, that the human spirit, when properly tended, can survive anything, overcome anything, and transform even the most bitter ground into soil where new dreams can take root and flourish. The pocket watch ticks steadily in my lap, keeping time for a future that belonged to all of us now. The survivors and the seekers, the healers and the helpers, the women who refused to be erased and the people who refused to let them disappear. Time that was finally, truly our own.